The Arctic has large deposits of rare earth elements, oil and gas. China wants to do this in ways that will clash with European priorities and values. They're not just arenas of the global commons, they're arenas of geopolitical competition.
Melting Arctic ice may be a climate concern, but it's also an opportunity for trading nations to move their goods around the globe. Well, a new report warns that China could try to exert outsized influence on Arctic routes and even control access in the future. Helena Legarda wrote that report for the Mercator Institute for China Studies, also known as MERIX, and she joins me now. Helena, welcome. Where are we in this process of accessibility in the Arctic? Because we still see freezes, we still see that not all the ice is gone during the summer. Help us understand what timeline we're looking at.
So the Arctic is still quite closed off to shipping routes for most of the year. I think currently it can only be navigated seasonally for about 3 to 4 months every year over the summer, between July and October or November. And even during this time, the route is still quite complicated. You've got ice, it's quite dark, fog, rapid weather changes, no real infrastructure nearby in case of accidents. So it's a route that's complex, that still requires icebreakers. And if we think about the Northern Sea route, which is the one I'm talking about here, it does go along Russia's coast through Russia's, territorial waters or exclusive economic zone. So Russia charges a transit fee still. So what we have today is a pretty tiny amount of trade going through this route. Russia claims about 90 ships went through this route last year compared to about 13,000 through the Suez Canal. What we're thinking about in terms of timeline is, to a certain extent, anybody's guess, but through climate change, the ice caps are melting and the route is open longer and longer every year. Some studies suggest that it might be ice-free during the summer already by the 2030s, so only a few years from now.
Okay, so when we talk about access denial, we're talking about this gradual process through which nations or shipping companies can navigate the open parts of the ice. But then I guess when it's fully melted at some points, then it's harder to deny access? Maybe help us understand.
So once it's ice-free, of course, it will be open to shipping all year round. But there is still the requirement by Russia to pay a transit fee in order to enter its own territorial waters or go through its own exclusive economic zone. So there will still be some restrictions when it comes to the availability and the openness of the Northern Sea route, but they will not be physical. They will be regulatory or political.
Okay. Well, what economic value do these routes have when it comes to nations like China?
When it comes to the shipping route, I think the first thing to mention is that the Northern Sea route shortens the travel time between Europe and Asia by about 15 days compared to going through the Suez Canal, and even longer if you compare it to the routes that go around the Horn of Africa. And this, of course, also reduces fuel costs. Additionally, being able to ship or sail through the Northern Sea route would provide China with alternative trade routes that would allow it to bypass choke points like the Strait of Malacca or the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea that Beijing is quite concerned about. So as a trade route, it's something that Beijing is quite keen on exploring. And this is one of the reasons why China and Russia have already set up a new buddy to jointly develop the Northern Sea route, and they are pushing quite hard to make it more accessible.
When we look at China's progress, I was looking at your report. They have 3 new icebreakers since 2019, research stations in Iceland and in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard. And then the Chinese Coast Guard entered Arctic waters for the first time in October 2024, together with Russian forces, if I have that right. How would you compare the level of ambitions that we're seeing from China with other nations that are also saying, hey, we need to be present here?
China's ambitions, I think, are just better defined. The Arctic, or rather the poles, so the Arctic and Antarctica, are considered in China's strategic thinking what they call strategic new frontiers. These are arenas that Beijing considers will be critical to China's geopolitical competition with the United States and the West more broadly, and to its broader strategic ambitions of becoming a global power by 2049. And China realized, I think, the critical importance of the Arctic for these objectives earlier than many countries did, especially in Europe. So for Beijing, these are not arenas, they're not just arenas of the global commons, they're arenas of geopolitical competition. And China has been acting accordingly over the last few years to expand its own footprint in the Arctic and to be prepared for the time when climate change and technological advancements open up access to more and more nations. So effectively, they started earlier.
You write about how a lot of these efforts are on the civilian side or on the research side, but that there is this aspect of dual civil military use by China. Can you explain that a little bit better?
Of course. So China's activities in the Arctic and in many of these other strategic new frontiers, but in the Arctic in particular, are often presented externally as being win-win and about multilateral cooperation and scientific advancement. So China tends to lead with this. But there is a very clear dual-use nature to its activities. And this is a reflection of the fact that in Chinese strategic thinking, the Arctic is very securitized. It's seen as key to China's not just grand strategic ambitions, but also to its own national security. So if you think, for example, about some of the ground stations that you mentioned earlier, the satellite ground stations that China has in the Arctic, of course, they do track and link China's scientific satellites, but they also support intelligence collection and the accuracy of China's Beidou global positioning system, so its alternative to GPS, which then provides missile targeting capabilities to the Chinese military, for instance. China's scientific research expeditions in the Arctic, of course, conduct scientific research, but also acoustic modeling and oceanographic surveys that will be key for PLA Navy submarines to operate effectively in the Arctic. And we have also seen Chinese ships and research expeditions testing military capabilities like unmanned underwater vehicles while in the Arctic. So we see very much a linkage between China's civilian activities and military objectives in that region.
What are then Europe's interests here? Is it simply not to be denied access to this area? And how far behind are they?
I think it's a combination, right? So when you think about the economic domain, I think China's growing footprint presents greater competition for resources, for access to trade routes, and to potential new economic opportunities in the Arctic. And this can have an impact on Europe's economic growth, future economic prosperity, and also on its own energy security and de-risking efforts. The Arctic has large deposits of rare earth elements, oil and gas, that Europe was one of the actors hoping to potentially explore in the future. But that's a bit more on the defensive side of things. When you think about governance, for instance, one of the objectives that China has for the Arctic as well is to be able to shape the rules that govern the region. And China wants to do this in ways that will clash with European priorities and values. For example, by eliminating any universally binding rules and putting national interest and national sovereignty at the top. And we can't forget about the security sphere. So a greater Chinese military or dual-use presence close to Europe's borders, when we think about the fact that many Arctic countries are members of the European Union and are European countries. This will require constant monitoring. It will require resources being dedicated to keeping an eye on what Chinese actors are doing. And it will also increase concerns for potential espionage operations or even disruptions to undersea cables, trade routes, etc. And this is even more so the case when we consider that China is increasingly cooperating with Russia in the Arctic and beyond. So it's a domain that will be critical to Europe's interests today and in the future, and where Europe is still behind. Europe is still behind, and it is only recently that the Arctic is truly being considered as a domain that is critical to Europe's own geopolitical standing, economic prosperity, and security.
You write in the same report about space as another domain. Do the same issues essentially apply here, that this kind of Chinese civil military approach and then Europe's lack of capability?
Yes, absolutely. Space is another one of the so-called strategic new frontiers that Beijing has defined. So we have the Arctic, or rather the poles, outer space, cyberspace, and the deep seas, or the undersea domain. The approach is not identical across all four of these domains. China doesn't have a single strategy that applies to all of them, but the key characteristics apply. And so does the impact that China's growing footprint and ambitions will have on Europe. China's activities in these domains, in space as well as the Arctic, is all about geopolitical competition and its ambition to become a global power. They are domains that are increasingly securitized. China's activities are often dual use, or they have dual use implications, and cooperation with Russia is rapidly increasing. So space is definitely another domain that Europe needs to be paying close attention to going forward.
You've touched on this a bit already, but you write that Europe was China's preferred partner in the Arctic as well as in space. Now it's Russia. Remind us again, how significant is that for Europe?
The issue for Europe here is that for many years, Europe did not consider the Arctic or outer space as geopolitically significant domains, and they did not really consider the implications of their cooperation with China. So we saw quite significant transfers of technology from Europe to China, and also European countries giving China access to the Arctic and supporting China's ambitions in a way. In space, if we think about Europe's Galileo program, again, for sort of satellite positioning systems, China was a member of the program originally. It contributed money, it was quite engaged, and it was a few years up until Europe expelled it. And China's ground stations in the Arctic were all set up on European territory. This has now changed. Over the last few years, Europe's perspectives on China, views of China, and the willingness to engage in cooperation, especially in sensitive domains like this one, has, of course, shrunk dramatically. So a lot of the projects that China wanted to conduct with Europe have been frozen or have been canceled. We've seen a number of those cases. But it doesn't, again, take away from the fact that for quite a number of years, it was Europe that was unwittingly contributing to China's ambitions in these domains. That's gone, so China is now turning to Russia as its preferred partner to help it bridge the gaps that it might have, either in terms of capabilities or in terms of geographical access. We can't forget that China is not an Arctic country. China does define itself as a near-Arctic state, but it doesn't have direct access to the Arctic.
When we talk about Europe's capabilities, we know that so often they've depended on the U.S., especially for strategic capabilities. How important is it right now that that relationship between Europe and the U.S. has become a lot more uncertain and is even fraying in many areas?
That is definitely a critical issue for Europe at this moment. When it comes to the Arctic, when it comes to outer space, cooperation with the United States would, of course, be ideal for Europe to be able to push back against some of China's activities, but also simply to defend its own interest and security. The reality is that cooperation with the United States on some of these issues right now seems more and more difficult. So Europe will need to find a way to act alone. Europe will need to invest more in its own capabilities, and it will need to find alternative partners. And of that, there are plenty like-minded countries that Europe could be engaging more when it comes to either the Arctic or space.
All right, that's Helena Legarda with the Mercator Institute for China Studies. Helena, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.